But like Tim the Toolman Taylor said, we need more power. The horsepower wars quickly ramped up in the late 50s with the introduction of the Hemi. Supercars and hypercars would break the 1,000 horsepower barrier, and new technology with electric motors are allowing production cars to see over 2,000 horsepower. And with ever advancing technology, who knows when we'll see the limit of horsepower. One of the common themes with muscle cars is, of course, horsepower. You know, amount of power that you got, that number rating. You know, people talk about how big the engine is. You know, sometimes it would be similar where your cubic inch was the same as your horsepower, you know. But what's actually interesting too is to me, torque did a lot more, especially if you're just going right off the line, you know, at the starting gate. But we're going to be talking about the horsepower wars today. Throughout the history since the very beginning up until now, when, you know, you're talking 1,000 plus horsepower, 2,000 plus horsepower on production cars.
That's right. It's amazing what we're seeing nowadays. But
yeah,
there are some things that we should talk about because, you know, first off, what's horsepower?
Well, and that's, yeah, you know, the definition of horsepower was, you know, founded by James Watt, who obviously did the watt, you know, kilowatt as well.
Right.
So measuring, you know, all kinds of energy. And basically that was one full grown horse. You know, so we're not talking a little pony horse,
right,
or,
right.
you know,
little Shetland or
little,
something.
Yeah. They might be, you know, quarter horsepower or something like that.
Yeah.
But, you know, working in the mines, they had a measurement of 33,000, you know, pound feet of work, basically,
right.
or torque. It's kind of tough to, it's kind of tough to gauge that of, okay, you know, we think of horsepower as maybe that's what's going to give you the speed, you know, carry on, where torque is like, you know, right off the line.
Okay.
So
there's
break it down for me.
So there's a classic meme out there.
All right.
That is, of all people, Jonathan Winters is the actual image. Jonathan Winters being the comedian.
Okay.
And he's kind of holding up his finger going like this. Mm-hmm. And the meme, it's the easiest way to explain this. Horsepower is what gets you to the brick wall. Torque is what pushes you through the brick wall.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Are you going to smash the brick wall, or is it going to smash you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the best way to explain what horsepower, but between horsepower and torque.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was the basically the horsepower, you know, measurement and foundation of it, and what we base, you know, pretty much all, you know, our cars on. Now it's gotten a little bit different, especially with the kilowatt hours or the kilowatts with electric vehicles. There's also, you know, we have our horsepower is basically our imperial measurement, and then there's a metric measurement.
Which I was today years old when I figured out what PS to me is PlayStation.
Right? Yeah, we'll have to put the actual name of it down here because it's tough to pronounce, but it's a German word for basically horsepower, but metrically you know, based. But so we're gonna go back to the very beginning, the first automobile, you know, by Benz,
right?
Carl Benz, you know, so 1895. It was 0.75 horsepower.
Right.
So the horsepower measurement and designation didn't come about with cars. It was obviously pre-existing.
Sure.
It wasn't necessarily even to compare a car to a horse, you know, on a carriage or something like that.
Right.
It was its own measurement, but it was applied to the cars.
Well, I mean, think of this too. Like, most horses are between, let's say, 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. And they're a large animal. I mean, like the whole hands thing, right? You know, 15 hands 15 or whatever, right? So if you were even to put like a horse next to a Honda CRX, you would start to laugh.
Yeah, right? But that CRX has, you know,
140 horsepower compared to, or really 110 if it's a CRX, but still 110 horsepower. You look at that little car.
100 times the power of that horse.
Right.
But that horse could probably crush that car.
Oh, amazing. Yes.
Especially if it's a, you know, Clydesdale or something like that.
Yeah.
But, and it wasn't that far off that then the horsepower war started, if you will. Because 1904, Rolls-Royce, you know, put out one of their cars that had 10 horsepower.
Right.
So, I mean, you're talking within 10 years going from less than 1 horsepower to 10 horsepower. Whereas, let's say a carriage or a stagecoach or whatever, at that time, maybe you'd have 6 horses max, 3 horses, usually 2 or 3 horses.
Right.
So
Well,
definitely is advancing on that.
The good thing for us being lovers of horsepower is that the world embraced horsepower as soon as automobiles came out. I mean, speed was the big thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, myself being, Barney Oldfield's great nephew, I mean, he was the world's famous man at the time. And it was because of car racing.
Yeah.
And, you look at the cars that he was driving in and you look at kind of the stuff they were doing and even the speeds they were going was pretty sketchy. Okay.
Well, that's if anyone's ever been in a new nice car going 130 miles an hour,
right,
theoretically,
right,
hypothetically,
yes, in Mexico,
you take that, feeling that you have and you apply that to an old 80s car, an old 60s car, an old 30s car,
right.
If you get up to 70 miles an hour, you're probably at the same level of anxiety and feeling that speed.
Yeah, I mean, Barney's Blitzen Benz, I mean, it had speeds up to 140 miles an hour.
Wow.
And this is like,
this is
in the teens. So we're talking like 1915, 1916.
Yeah. Do you remember how much horsepower that was?
I don't know. I could probably look it up.
We'll have to look it up. Boom, right there.
Yeah. Blitzen Benz is a pretty famous car. Yeah. So, yeah.
And then, so obviously things kept advancing, kept going. The cars got a lot bigger. You look at the Model T or the earlier, like I said, the one from Benz is basically the same as like a Stagecoach, but not horse powered. Has horsepower.
Right.
And obviously cars started to get more automobile like, and you had these huge cars, fancy cars in the 20s, into the 30s that needed the horsepower to more or less just kind of get it going.
Well, let's also look at this too. It wasn't just automobiles, the advancement of engines for that matter, like airplanes.
Airplanes.
You look at all of a sudden now you've got World War II, an Allison 12-cylinder, airplane engine made 1,400 horsepower.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So you're talking in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
And,
the Rolls-Royce Merlin made almost close to 2,000 horsepower in those P-51 Mustangs.
So, and granted, those are a lot bigger than you put in a car.
Right.
But it's just the technology was there to adapt it.
Now, hang on. Duesenberg's had V12s.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up.
There you go. Okay.
Yep. So 1930, there was an ad, of Duesenberg ad, in which we all know Duesenbergs are pretty big, pretty heavy.
Right.
But they were touting the fact that they made 265 horsepower.
Yeah.
In 1930.
1930. And those cars went 100 miles an hour.
And that's still a big car for that.
Yeah. Right.
But that's, and honestly, they probably needed it to be that big of a car to hold that engine.
Right.
We look at the front, from the firewall, the cowl forward.
Right.
They're pretty long because you've got that big old engine.
Think of this. A Duesenberg is about the size of a Suburban.
Yeah.
It's pretty close to the wheelbase of a Suburban.
Pretty big.
Right. It's a pretty big car. And a lot of that is, like you mentioned, a lot of it is a very long, powertrain.
Like nose, yeah.
Right. So, but it's amazing to see those cars. They weigh, pretty close to a Suburban too. They probably weigh 7,000 pounds. That's at me guessing. But, for 1930s, 7,000 pound car going 100 miles an hour at 265 horsepower. Yeah, that's
it needed that power to move it, but it still was moving.
Right.
But that was like your high end, your top end.
Right.
Obviously the 30s into World War II, things kind of obviously changed, kind of died out. But it's in the late 40s when we start to see the V8 really come in.
Well, first off, don't forget the Buick Straight 8s. The Buick Straight 8s in the late 40s were a huge powertrain. And that was kind of, the guys, if you were looking for big horsepower, that was, one of the engines you'd go to. Some of, obviously, the late 40s were starting to get back. Some of the early pioneers were getting the, we're getting the Vic Edelbrocks. We're getting the Alex Exidius.
Yeah, you start getting the hot rod guys adding more power to, and that's what they were doing a lot of, was taking those engines that were the bigger engines for the bigger luxury cars, throwing them in Model A, 32, and you're talking about your power to weight ratio.
Well, you've got 49, you've got the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 motor that comes out.
So how many horsepower?
Man, you know what? I think this one was 230. Ooh, was it
135.
Close? Oh, wow, I'm way off. Right, wow, way off. Okay.
So that was 1949 Cadillac with their V8 introduced 160 horsepower. 160, so they beat out Olds.
So,
but it really started to ramp up from there.
Okay,
that was like the very beginning, and it really started to shoot up. We start getting into the 200s, even the 300s by the mid 50s.
Sure.
Packard had a 260 horsepower engine. The Chrysler 300.
That's right.
It was named the 300 because it's got 300 horsepower.
That's
right. So the mid 50s is when we start breaking into the 200s or the 300 horsepower range.
Well, and think about it too. That's when we're really starting to see kind of World War II engineering being approached into passenger cars.
Yeah.
So now you're going to see a guy that's like, okay, we have these V8 engine blueprints and whatever that we used, back from the war, and plus we have, huge freaking.
We got a huge workforce of people that had mechanical knowledge, and that's what started hot rodding. But it also, helped the designers and engineers at all the OEMs.
Well, and also the hits that ran away, the Y block Ford replacing the it was an overhead cam engine. It wasn't like the flathead Ford. So the Y block Ford was a big advancement. Zorov Duntov, which I know I said his name wrong. Obviously they introduced the 265 V8 and 55. So General Motors has a hit, but also too Chrysler's killing it. They're taking knowledge from DeSoto. They're taking knowledge from the Studebaker guys. They're putting all this together, and they create this engine called the hemispherical combustion style engine.
Yeah, and it was way above and beyond anything else that was out right there. 1957, the Hemi was 390 horsepower. Yep. So you're talking levels that would be considered good horsepower today. And that was in the late 50s.
But now those were in boats of cars. They were in New Yorkers, Chrysler Imperials. I mean, they were in the full-size, four-door, large cars.
Yeah, family cars. The equivalent of a Suburban still, like we said. Like, that's still the size-wise and weight-wise, it's, Duesenberg.
Yeah.
But some of the guys did start to look at putting these or putting the higher horsepower in the smaller packages, because at that same time, you had Corvette, with the Ramjet engine, and that was the very first one-to-one, horsepower cubic inch, basically. So your square,
it's called
square motor. Yeah. So that was, in 57, and that was obviously after Chevy had already, developed the small block Chevy V8 engine that we kind of know and love, or became very popular.
Right.
But that all kind of obviously led to the muscle car era. The first, like I said, there was clearly horsepower wars of people trying to one up each other throughout the decades. But I think most people would think horsepower wars, they think the muscle car era.
Well, before we leave the 50s, I've got a funny story to tell you, because I know I have a lot of boat racing background, and one of my mentors that I was growing up with, his name is Rudy Ramos, and he was the guy that actually invented the fiberglass boat process, where he would basically make a boat out of fiberglass rather than wood. So drag racing was a big thing back then on land, but boat racing also was another thing that was kind of getting its feet wet, literally. And Rudy was a USAC driver, so he drove quarter midgets and midgets and did very well. As a matter of fact, did so well they got kicked out of USAC. So he ended up
thinking he was cheating or something.
No, they fully. Well, the other thing too, he lied about his age.
Oh,
so they and he wasn't
too
old.
young.
He was too young.
Wow.
Yeah. So he's only 14 when he won. He basically won a championship here on the West Coast.
Child prodigy,
right? Child
with
prodigy,
engines, basically in boats.
So he had a younger friend that lived close, because Rudy grew up in Southgate, and he had a little younger friend that used to hang around him. His name was Keith Black.
And a lot of people maybe watching this will know that name.
So Keith Black was in junior high school. Rudy was just turned 16, and Rudy's parents, they drove off to Palm Springs in Rudy's dad's Chrysler New Yorker, and left his mom's Cadillac that had a 331 in it.
And what year was this again?
This was 1955. Okay, so 331 Cadillac sitting there. Keith and Rudy pulled the motor out of Rose's Cadillac, put it into their boat, went down to Long Beach Stadium, and broke a record. Okay? So they spin back home, because
you got to put it back together.
Ray and Rose are coming home from Palm Springs. Now, Palm Springs back then, too, was about a 3-hour drive. It was not your 10 freeway. So they had some time to kind of get the thing back together. But sure enough, they get back home, and they're hoisting their engine out of the boat, and they get caught with Rose's Cadillac with the thing, sitting front up. And Rudy's dad walks up to him, and Ray's like, "Hey, what's going on here?" And he goes, "I broke a record." He goes, "You broke your mom's car. You better figure this out." Right? But that was
her car better be driving the next morning.
Yeah, but that was the next. So what basically Ray said is, well, then you know what? We're going to get you another motor. So they ended up buying a Cadillac motor, putting it in his boat, and
kept going.
And obviously that's how Keith Black got his start.
Yeah.
So
that's amazing. Hey, that's cool. At least that the parents, we're like, okay, yeah, don't do this, but we're going to support
Put your mom's
what you're
car
trying
back
to do.
Together.
Yeah. Don't take our stuff apart, but let's get you, clearly you know what you're doing and you're going to be going in this industry. So let's support you. So that's always good. But,
so for most
but yeah,
of the
so what did Keith Black kind of do then to start off? Because like we mentioned before, we're talking about all the OEMs and going in the muscle car era, but look at all the hot rod guys that were at this exact same time period.
Absolutely.
Adding power to those engines or smaller engines and, all the modifications just go as fast as they could.
Well, Keith was just one of the
early pioneers of
but not
power.
only that.
Are we calling this pioneers of power?
Pioneers of power. There you go. But you got to remember the late 50s, early 60s in Southern California. Everything's here, right? And most of the reason is because of aerospace. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these guys, Keith Black himself, he had a lot of engine development money come his way just because of aerospace. And also the engineers working at aerospace, those guys wanted to drag race.
Yeah, they were hanging out and tinkering, helping out.
You've got Lions drag strip where they're pulling, Hemi motors out of the wrecking yard behind it and putting it into a rail dragster and going out and running the same day. I mean, so this is like the heyday of horsepower as far as, Southern California is concerned. Mm-hmm. But Keith was one of those standouts. He was very good at tuning and extremely good at engine building. So that's why also too, a lot of people came to him because of Lions. They was, he's kind of known as that guy. So, I would say the other standout would be basically also another guy named, Ed Pink. Mm-hmm. And Ed Pink's deal was not as much really as drag racing, more or less as USAC racing. So we're talking, Indy cars and that kind of engine development. So, where you had that, you had Shelby down there in Gardena too, where Shelby was working on Trans Am cars and doing a lot of engine development with Ford. You had the Shaver brothers that were in Torrance that, if you drove a sprint car, you had one of the Shaver's motors. Even up to this day, you still want to run a Shaver motor if you're still running a West Coast sprint car. So there's a ton of those guys that all kind of start out, but it's interesting to see how one guy had drag racing down, one guy had,
they'd find their specialties, find their little niche and what they, worked on. But do you recall any of the standout like power numbers or what was kind of maybe the average of those guys back then?
I mean, if you were a street car, if you were running 300 to 400 horsepower on the street, that was a serious car. Yeah. That was, even if you were trying to ramp up a car, like if you did like a cam swap with a header upgrade and guys like Bob Hedman were building stuff like, tunable parts that would help you make more horsepower with your car. So, if you
look at carburetors too, exactly. I mean, that was a huge advancement to get this horsepower going. Single carburetor, barrel carburetor, 4-barrel carburetor, really kind of, ramped up the ability to create power.
Well, you need more fuel if you're going to make more power. So that's kind of their mentality. And then the same thing too, if you're making more power, you've got to have a way for the power to get out. So exhaust systems became a big deal. Guys like, Doug Thorley, for example, he started, a business making tunable headers for race cars that can still be driven on the street. Yeah. And he did a lot of different advancement stuff and he worked with more like torque ideas. So his idea was how to capture the torque and how to build more power through his exhaust. Yeah. Amazing kind of stuff that we would only know that if there wasn't the aerospace industry around saying like, hey, keep pushing this. Mm-hmm. So that I guess was the start of it. But, as far as muscle cars too, we start to get into the big numbers as far as like, let's say a Pontiac GTO 389. That's your 64 Pontiac GTO. That was the power plant of choice.
Yeah. And that hit it and, 325 horsepower.
325
so
horsepower,
like you said,
right?
Within that 300 to 400 range for a street car. And also too, thinking about the power and how to kind of judge that of, the 0 to 60 is always a thing. And that obviously has a lot to do with the weight, some of the torque aspect, but just for reference, that GTO was a 7-second 0 to 60 car. Right. So pretty quick for that time.
For the time. And the weight of that car.
And it's a lot of weight. And that's what, you talked about Shelby. So the Shelby Cobra was 260 horsepower, so a lot less, but a lot smaller car. And that was about a 4.5 second car. Right. So that's, that Shelby Cobra at the time in the early 60s was essentially the same as what you'd be trying to quote now with a supercar or a, Tesla or something like that. You're in that, 0 to 60 in under 5 second range. But yeah, so the muscle car era really started. Obviously we've mentioned the GTO kind of being what's considered the first muscle car. Right. And it really started to ramp up there, where you had to pretty much be in your high 300 range.
Yeah.
You know, the late 60s is really when it started to even creep more up into the 400s.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and I mean, you look at the 1970 454 Chevelle being the top of the, you know, the heap at 450 horsepower, which again,
and 575 foot-pounds of torque.
Right.
Like I said, I know we're calling this horsepower wars, but torque's got a lot to do with it too.
A ton to do with it.
Yeah.
So, you know, and a lot of people, they kind of look at, or they think of that car not being the one, they think of it, oh, it's got to be a Hemi or something like that. Well, Hemis were right behind. You know?
No, they weren't that far off, but
425.
Yeah. Things were all, you know, you start getting in the late 60s with your Chevy, with your, you know, the Hemis and stuff like that. You're in incremental ranges, and you're in, you know, 425, 415, 430, 450. You're all in that kind of range. But like, for example, the 1969 Camaro ZL1.
Okay.
430 horsepower.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of on the heels of that Chevelle. And obviously things started to taper off in the 70s.
Sure.
But I think racing ramped up.
Well, that's the other thing I was just going to bring up, is even during the 60s, you know, the horsepower wars was a big thing. I mean, look at the hoods of the NASCARs. They would even say like how big the cubic inch was and what horsepower. Like you'd have the Fireball Roberts car with like 425 horsepower on the top of the hood. You know, that kind of stuff.
A lot of the advertising too at that time for the muscle cars was, you know, usually I always see with it's, oh, this has these nice features for a road trip with your family,
right?
Or, you know, it's got this style or this, whatever. They were advertising the horsepower ratings.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and for the most part, there always has been that, you know, when that is what the public is wanting.
Well, right.
So.
I mean, that's the whole Tim Taylor, that kind of
more power,
more power thing, right? So, but you know, and also too, racing did do that, because now let's look at let's look at stock car racing or NASCAR racing. You know, there was a lot of, you know, different teams that developed engines and made a lot more horsepower, more than the rated horsepower was given from the factory. I mean, you start looking at the bigger teams, the Junior Johnsons from the 60s. You look at the Richard Pettys from the 60s. You look at their engine build program. They weren't just getting factory engines. Sure, they were getting the engine from the manufacturers, but they're tearing them apart and doing whatever they could to make speed.
Yeah.
And the biggest guy out of that was Smokey Yunick. Now, and of course, too, depends on who you're asking, was Smokey the biggest cheater or was he the biggest genius?
I mean, there's a line.
Right.
There's a fine line.
Well, I like what his line was always, it's not in the rule book, it's not a rule.
And I agree 100% with that.
And I've even quoted that before.
I was going to say, I agree that.
Not in the rule book. So,
I mean, this is what says the rules I got to follow. So if you didn't think of it and I did.
Right. Hey. You know, but Smokey was one of those unique guys that understood combustion. So he was able to manipulate it in different ways. So if it was, even if the race called for a supercharger, you know, he would use a turbocharger, just because he knew more information about it, right? So if the application called for naturally aspirated, well, he would figure out a way to not only just, he would cool different things down, or he would design different ways of fuel and air to get to things so it would make more power. Now, was it legal? Of course not, but it wasn't.
But it wasn't the rule book. Yeah. Well, and that's he did a lot of creative things with the bodies. I know there's stuff we have seen with Camaros of like narrowed or kind of chopped and slanted down, and I mean it's all the old hot rod tricks, but he was the guy just trying to find anything out. And what's funny, you look at that and think, oh, is he cheating, or it's not in the rule book? Okay, but you know, you go now to, and granted they'll do it more maybe for efficiency, for mileage and stuff like that, but go to any wind tunnel, you know, or computer simulation now with an OEM,
right?
You know, they're figuring out like, oh, I can add this little indent on the side view mirror to get a little bit better aerodynamics and increase the mileage or power or whatever. So it's all the same deal, same tricks and stuff. It's just trying to make more power, trying to make it more efficient, basically.
Right.
So,
well, but NASCAR also too, even some of the lower, how do I say that? The lower classes, you know, those guys too, there's a lot of advancement came up that way. I mean, Ray Everham was one of the first guys to drive a 383 that was, you know, kind of go back to the same thing you said, a square engine, where it actually made 1 horsepower per cubic inch. A lot of that stuff was developed by Everham back in the early 70s for his circle track stuff. So, then you're looking at, all right, so if 300 or, 350 was a good number and 383 was a good number, or 400 horsepower was a good number in the early 70s for a street car, you look at the advancement of like your Hellcats or your Demons or some of these Mustang engines that are pumping out 600, 700, 900 horsepower for a street car.
Yeah.
That's the difference in the last 50 years.
Well, and that's, I pulled up saw some information on that. Basically saying, and granted, like the 70s, 80s kind of went down, and a lot of, with the power because of the oil crisis, and they even would kind of they started to lower the rating of the horsepower. Like, this engine does this or it's capable of that, but they're advertising that it does less horsepower because of that mentality at the time. But from 1980 to 2010, so we're talking, span of, 30 years.
So, yeah.
The average car, so this is everything from a, Ford Pinto to a Toyota Camry to Ford Mustang or Challenger, whatever, Charger. The average horsepower across the board increased more than double.
Oh, yeah.
In the last, from 1980 to 2010.
Right, absolutely.
So, averaging out, of course. But it's just, you're saying, whereas, a V6 Toyota Camry, or I don't even know if a V6 is in a Toyota Camry, but whatever.
Yeah.
But that's probably got more horsepower than most of your muscle cars in the 60s.
Right,
did.
correct. Yeah. The efficiency of just engine design has
and that's
grown
computer, electronics, EFI.
Yes.
So we're going to be starting to get into the super high horsepower numbers and the technology on all of that. So if you go to Beltec.com and put in the promo code AutoRevolution24, you're going to be getting one of these limited edition Cato House Beltec trucks on any order over $299. So basically all your lift kits, your lowering kits, your performance. This thing's slammed on some gold wheels. You've got a Beltec notch cover in the back. So if you go use AutoRevolution24, you get one of these. And for some of the smaller orders, they're going to be randomly selecting a winner to get some posters and calendars as well. So if you go online, use AutoRevolution24 at Beltec.com. Now back to the show.
So the thing that we're missing too is we need to talk about obviously what types of fuels that fuel these engines, because horsepower is also made by fuel.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and you're looking at the combination. You have to, if you're increasing the size of an engine, you have to have more fuel. You have to have more air. You have to have more combustion. It's all a formula that kind of builds up. And if you're missing one part of it, you're only going to hit a certain level.
Right. Well, a lot of these guys that, again, too, from the Southern California area that had experience with the military, but also had aerospace on their side, they ran across different fuels. So basically when they ran across nitromethane, that changed a lot. And obviously that was, some fuels that were used basically for rockets. So
hey, I mean, if it makes a rocket go fast,
then hey, it can make, it'll make this thing go fast for a minute or two before it blows up.
Hey, you only need like 4 seconds and you're fine.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time, right? Yep. So much so that even NHRA actually banned nitromethane for a few years. So they actually call it the fuel ban, which I believe
was it because it was
too dangerous?
Okay.
Yes. So
they just weren't sure about it yet. Basically.
Well, the other problem too is how do you put nitromethane out? There's no way of putting it out. So even the safety safari was like, this thing catches on fire, we don't know how to put it out. So for a few years, I think it was 62 to 65. Boy, that might be my memory.
So early
mid-60s. They basically did a fuel ban. And
so what was the only fuel you could use? Was just
gasoline or alcohol?
Alcohol. Okay.
Alcohol.
That's it. Yeah.
And alcohol, those classes became more well known at that time because obviously to make more power, alcohol was making a bigger boom basically. So in line now, they reintroduced fuel in the late 60s, and that's when we start to see huge numbers. We start to see the 200-mile-an-hour barrier break. We start to see guys like, Big Daddy Don Garlits that actually, he blew himself up at the starting line in Lions, so and blew half of his foot off.
So maybe that ban wasn't
quite enough, but
extended or whatever.
But those guys kept pushing it though. Those guys kept making you would hear numbers like on the street of 300, 400 horsepower. Those guys were saying 2,000, 5,000. You know, and even like a modern day top fuel motor makes 15,000 horsepower.
Yeah.
So nitromethane is something to be reckoned with.
That's
right?
a rocket, literally.
Oh, it totally is. You know, but drag racing also too. I mean, it also brought other, you know, classes, obviously, like I mentioned, the alcohol classes. But what really got popular during the 70s was throughout the 60s, there was super stock, which were race cars that were based off of, you know, factory engines. So your Dyno Don Nicholson that pretty much ruled that class throughout the 60s. They rolled into the 70s and they created a new class called Pro Stock. And Pro Stock was you had to have the stock body configuration of a car, and you were only limited to 500 cubic inches. So, for example, like Bob Glidden used to kill everybody in a little small Pinto runabout, but it had a 500 horse or had a 500-inch Ford motor in it.
Yeah.
In this small little,
your power to weight is just insane.
But those guys, I think, were the true geniuses. Those were like, you know, I mentioned Bob Glidden. He was a huge genius in that. There's the Warren Johnsons that were out there. He was kind of the Chevy guy. Ryer Morrison was another. They were a group. There were two guys that were kind of the engine builders for a lot of different Pro Stock guys. So let's say they were the kind of the pioneers of the early 70s and into the kind of the 80s. But by the 80s, Pro Stock was a huge class. And, you know, Ryer Morrison was kind of still your top guys, but you had Lee Shepard came in. And again, too, Warren Johnson for many, many years, who just kind of dominated the class. But those were the guys that were running those cars 7 seconds on 500 cubic inches. They had to develop everything themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And that also kind of comes into a funny story, too, because in 1991, the Mopar guys were kind of the standouts, which was kind of a joke for many, many years because the Mopar guys throughout the 80s did nothing. And then all of a sudden, these two guys, Scott Jeffreyon and Daryl Alderman, were the two drivers for a company called Wayne County Speed. And they had the factory Mopar like ride.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned, they didn't want to race in a long time. And all of a sudden they won like 10 in a row.
Something's up.
Right. and
you don't get that good overnight.
No way. Yeah. And also too, I mean, you're beating legends too on, you know, daily. And all of a sudden you guys are these newcomers that come on the scene. So there was a petition to go down to Wayne County Speed and check them out. And the kind of the
was that in Indiana?
Yes.
Wayne County,
yes.
Indiana?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they got kind of the word got out that they were going to come by, like, you know, the next, you know,
go
through
go
town.
check it out.
Right.
Check the place out.
And suddenly there was a break-in at the speed shop. And only the Pro Stock motors were damaged. Nothing was stolen. Just someone...
Which you'd think if someone's breaking into a high-end car shop, you're going to steal stuff.
Broke in, and then they took sledgehammers to the intake manifolds and destroyed the engines. And, of course, Wayne County never, you know, they never did anything afterwards. So it was definitely a setup.
Yeah. But. No, they were fixing the numbers. They were probably going outside the rule book.
Look, if you ain't...
If there was a rule book and they were breaking those rules, it wasn't if you didn't, you know, it wasn't like before where you're saying, oh, well, Smoky Unix, it's not in the rule book, I'm not breaking it. No, you're breaking the rule book.
But if you're drag racing, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying.
That's, you're squeezing every little bit of horsepower out that you can.
But even street cars got big then too. Like there was a lot of street cars. I mean, our friends Jeff Smith over there at Hot Rod Magazine, they started the fastest street car shootout, and I believe 86, 87. And there were some big names. Like that's where Pat Moosey got his kind of, you know, his big fame out of. Mike Moran was another big engine builder back then. Kenny Duttweiler. Yeah,
Duttweiler. Yeah, and he obviously, a lot of the horsepower stuff we're talking about was very, you know, 400 cubic inch, you know, like you said, the 500 cubic inch, and Duttweiler kind of found his niche in the V6 turbo applications.
Exactly. Right.
And that's also too in the 80s, you know, early mid 80s is when computer controlled engine, you know, and engine tuning via computer became, you know, a thing versus, you know, the screwdriver, carburetor, the tweaking timing here and there. Well, you can do it all on a computer now. And that really started to ramp up with racing, with, you know, and obviously the OEMs as well.
Oh yeah. And I mean, you had aftermarket systems like a Motec that came out, and that was leaps and bounds. I mean, now also too, boy, I can't think of the name of the company right now, but Mega Squirt Megasquirt computers came out, and this is all pre OBD2.
Yeah.
So this is like
late 80s, early 90s, or
mid 80s.
Mid 80s, okay.
Right when that came out. But those were the computer systems. The early day Excel had a computer system that people used a lot on. They were very archaic though, and very kind of touchy. So a lot of motorsports guys, including myself, were like, I don't want to have anything to do with that.
Yeah.
Just thinking because of the reliability issues. Now, of course, when things progress and as they progress, they get better and the information gets better. And obviously now we have it to where you wouldn't run anything without a computer.
Yeah. No, I mean, your limitations without, if you're trying to make power or reliability for that matter or anything, yeah, you're hooking that system up to it. And you can obviously, be driving the car while monitoring all of it and seeing all the different, parameters versus before maybe, unless you had a guy hanging out the window with a, screwdriver or something like that, you weren't getting actual live, adjustments and data on it. So, we kind of start to see, obviously there was a certain level of muscle cars and your performance cars, but the, supercars really started to come about in the 80s and into the 90s, and now we call them hypercars because, well, those are eclipsing the supercar,
right?
As far as performance goes. But just to kind of get a base reference for that, so you talk about the 80s, you talk about Ferraris. Who are you talking about? You're talking about Magnum,
right?
So his 84 Ferrari is 230 horsepower.
Okay, yes, it was.
So
all right. Again, so a friend of mine had that car growing up.
Mm-hmm.
He had a 308, and it was nicknamed Magnum.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Right.
Did he have a mustache?
No. Actually, Johnny looked like he really looked like Don Johnson. So him driving around Magnum's Ferrari looking like Don Johnson was really kind of funny.
It's like this is a Magnum PI Miami Vice crossover.
Exactly, right? Yeah,
exactly.
Something. But I remember driving that car, and that car was scary fast. Now, the reason for it, too,
is it's a small car.
It's a small car. It's a very small car. You are very low to the ground. It is geared to pull. I mean, that car would pull you back in the seat like no other. And I think that was the most impressive part about it. Now, could it turn? No. It would not turn. Johnny also had a 930 slant nose Porsche at the time.
Yeah, and Porsche's really, the power on Porsches really started to
that car was nicknamed the Widowmaker, and for a reason, because the turbo lag would come on like 15 minutes after you stood your foot on the throttle. All of a sudden, you put your foot on the gas and you wait, like you'd be like 1, 2, 3, whoa! And
you're trying to make your turn, and the turbo's kicking in, as you're coming around the bend, in the canyon or something. Yeah,
but that car was peel your eyelids back fast.
And what was that?
It was his car was a 76 930 turbo. But they called him the Widowmaker. And for reasons, because, you get a stockbroker guy that'd go out and buy a Porsche, and then he'd go wad the thing up because the turbo lag would come on.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, so you had a flat six, turbocharged, 182 cubic inch.
Right.
So way less than your muscle cars.
Yes.
But, 245 horsepower was the rating on that.
Yeah.
On a car that weighs...
What, 3,200 pounds, maybe? If that?
Let's see here.
I don't even think there's any way it could weigh that much.
Of course, like, it gives me all the specs of everything except for, I can tell you the compression ratio.
Yeah, right.
I can tell you the injection.
Sure.
Bore stroke.
But the car was fast.
2,600 pounds.
2,600 pounds.
That was the curb weight.
Okay, yeah. Right.
So...
fast.
And that was 150 mile an hour top speed on that.
Right.
So that's you're talking about your power to weight ratio. So we can quote numbers all day long.
Right.
It's going to obviously come down to what's the size, and also too at that point you're getting into tire technology too to make that power transfer actually to the ground. Otherwise, you're just lighting stuff up.
Well, that's where again too technology has just changed so much. Now we're talking about transmission, clutches, traction control, computer controlled,
all the computer controlled.
So yeah, I mean, but a lot of, you know, there's the older school drivers that say, I don't want any of that. I want it just all analog where I know what I'm doing. But then you see the guys that have been trained on that, and yes, all of it works. It's just how you've been taught.
Yeah.
You know,
and that's, it's essentially doing things that you would maybe do or try to do, but it allows people to be able to drive something that's 1,000+ horsepower,
right?
Or at least somewhat reasonably.
Well, even the racers do that too. I mean, if you're looking at NHRA today, the guy that's winning the race is the clutch man. Because everyone's got the power. They got the power. Yeah. I mean, obviously put more pop in it, you know, and the thing's going to make more power, right? But if you can't get that power to the ground, there's no use in having the power.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so, and then also that's the same thing too with street cars. You look at, you know, double disc clutches, that technology where all of a sudden, you know, that's, you go back to, you know, Red and Hayes. You go back to those guys,
clutches,
you know, those are the two guys that pioneered the double disc clutch. You know, that was for your racing technology and also your street driven, right? So you had to have a double disc clutch. Without that kind of stuff, we wouldn't get anywhere. Which takes me back to, before we leave the 80s, there's one thing I want to bring up. Because like you said, for the most part, all of the big three, for that matter, were building cars that were pretty boring during the 80s. You know, you had your 130 horsepower V8s and that kind of mess, right?
Nothing
stood out. Right.
Like, you had some, those are some cool stuff, but nothing was,
you know,
there wasn't a muscle car.
Even like an IROC Camaro didn't have a lot of horsepower, right? So, but now let's take that and look at what stock car racing was doing in the NASCAR guys. And I'm talking about, you know, engine builders like Robert Yates, who, you know, you're still only limited to 355 cubic inches in a NASCAR engine. He's making 700-800 horsepower in 1984.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah.
Right.
And then using a carburetor.
Same thing, right?
What wasn't it only until maybe 6-7 years ago that NASCAR started doing EFI?
Right.
So I mean, we're talking 30+ years difference of, you know. So you had to stick with kind of old technology, but you were able to make that much power.
You just had to dial it in that much. You had to just keep whittling at
every little thing you could do.
Right.
You know, and combination to think about.
At that time, the greatest technology that they had was an MSD box. Right?
Yeah.
So this is your computer control. Yeah. And then you're right. You know, all of the power came out of their cylinder heads. And that's really where they kind of played around with everything is. And that's how they made the power because, like I mentioned, the displacement was a set deal. You couldn't go any bigger than 355. So where else are you going to make the power at? The last place you can look is the cylinder heads. And that's why, you know, the advancement of the GM style SB2 small block, which is the preferred choice of NASCAR engines from the late 80s, early 90s. That stuff was, you had guys like Robert Yates. You had guys, Richard Childress Racing. You had those guys in there that were putting, Ray Everham too, again, his name comes up again, that was pushing to have these manufacturers make these kind of engines to make the power because there was just no way that they were going to make 700 horsepower out of the Buick Regal's, you know, 5-liter motor.
Yeah, you're
right.
Yeah, it's not exactly stock car, you know, anymore, but yeah, I mean, you're looking at the NASCAR ratings from, you know, 550 to 670, you know, depending on the track too, you had to, you know, do a restrictor.
Right.
But then is interesting. They, you know, later on NASCAR reduced the horsepower that you could have. They made that a rule.
Yeah. They're trying to slow the cars down.
And that's, because you're talking about 200+ mile an hour cars and it just, you can get too crazy on something like that. So,
well, I think that's something that, you know, NHRA's looked at a lot the last couple of years is they're trying to slow the cars down. You know, Goodyear's made it very, very public that they don't want the cars going faster than 350. And it's just because of the tire technology. They're like, guys, we can't keep a tire together. So,
well, and what's interesting is that, you know, and this is going way back, but just an example of the tire technology, you know, and I can't remember his name. I'll have to probably look it up, but like, in the 20s, you know, the Stutz.
Yes.
They were doing, you know, land speed on Daytona Beach.
Right.
And they were developing tires with these companies to be able to get them to hold up to that because tires weren't built for that back then.
Right.
You know, we're talking early 1900s.
Yeah.
And of course, what caused a wreck was
the tire.
He was sponsored by a tire company, but he was developing his own tire. And he had to use this other tire, you know, company's tires on it because of the sponsorship deal.
rolled
him over and killed the the racer on that. So it's you've got to you're making the power. You've got to make it transfer through everything, and you got to make it safe as well.
Well, there's let's talk about the Firestone Goodyear debate that happened at Talladega in 1969, where it was the opening year of Talladega.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, both tire manufacturers supported NASCAR drivers where you could pick either Firestone or Goodyear. And no one ever drove on a super speedway before. So when they went out and testing, the high banks were tearing the tires apart, and they were having a lot of wrecks.
Yeah.
To the point where they even said, we're not going to run this race. And Bill France came in and said, no, you guys have to run this race. Like, this track's brand new. Yeah. And it was only a small group of drivers that were the Goodyear-sponsored drivers, because Goodyear said, you know what, this is an opportunity for us to really stand out between Firestone, because Firestone said, we're not even going to run the race.
Oh, so they didn't want to put the time and the work in to make a tire that worked on that track. But
Goodyear saw that opportunity and told their drivers, go ahead. Now, this was funny. And it could have been the cliche that's, of Days of Thunder, like, Cole, you will hold entire, turn 4. But pretty much Goodyear did not know and just told the guys the tires are good. And
gave them the confidence,
to go out there and do it.
To run it. Yeah.
Right. So, and that's what, that started the stranglehold on, NASCAR for Goodyear for.
True. Yeah.
Up until now. Firestone still doesn't support NASCAR. So
it's interesting. Yeah. Hey. So
I guess let's start talking about modern cars. Like
your
Enzos.
Let me go through like the supercars and the hypercars.
Okay.
And then we'll stop, and then we'll get into the modern muscle, electric, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So we're talking about the advancement in technology, the advancement in these, high-end cars like the Ferrari, Lamborghinis, all that kind of stuff. The first more modern supercar to really kind of stand out and hit was the Bugatti Veyron.
Oh, yes.
And that was the fastest production car in the world for a long time. And
right.
So in 2005, that came out, and that was 1,600 horsepower.
Right.
And that was, 10 years before we got the 1,000 horsepower Challenger and, stuff like that. And it kind of seemed like it got to the point at the time where you had your muscle cars or your performance cars kind of at a range of your 400, 500 horsepower. Some of your higher end or your super cars were your, 700, 800, horsepower, but obviously weighing 2,000 pounds or something. Right. But then the hypercars kind of started to really just go kind of crazy. So let's just kind of run down just some of the numbers to show some of this. So you're talking about, your Ferrari, at the time, your F12, about 740 horsepower.
Right.
One of the big ones that kind of hit was the Koenigsegg 1-to-1.
Yeah.
So that was 1,000 horsepower.
Right.
And it weighed like 1,000 pounds.
Yeah, yeah.
So basically, instead of your square motor with your cubic inch matching your horsepower, it was now
power to weight.
There was a horse for every pound.
Yes.
And we were talking about the very beginning of 1 horsepower was 33,000 pounds of workforce basically.
Right.
Now we're talking for 1 pound to 1 horsepower.
Right.
And that's just honestly insane, but
pulls your eyeballs out of your head when you're accelerating.
That's G-force technology for sure.
Right.
And you've had some similar ones, like we're talking about, like the Lamborghini Revuelto,
right? 814
horsepower. The Pagani Huayra, which was everyone remembers that jumping. Hey, I guess you've got a car that can jump from one tower to another tower in Dubai. You can, get some power, I guess, but that was only about 760 horsepower. And like I said, with these, we got to remember the power to weight ratio, because these were,
these are like
super lightweight, titanium, carbon fiber, everything you could do, and just to maximize all of that. Last several years, we've started to get into, where it's still, EV motor. And the hypercars have kind of ushered in combining the technologies of the combustible engine and EVs.
Yes.
So you'd have motors that were, helping with the torque or helping with, the power and supplanting, the engines as well. So
and a lot of that again comes from racing.
Yeah.
You look at all of the Le Mans
cars, yeah.
and you look at the Porsche's probably had the best results out of that whole entire thing with their development with the regen and the brake system.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, too, it helps the car in its longevity because now if you're switching back over to an electric and letting the combustion engine breathe a little bit, and just even helping the thing down the track, I mean, obviously, you're just bringing the car more endurance.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I think that's the technology that we'll see in our own passenger cars.
Yeah. Well, and that's what you talk about Le Mans. That's 24-hour Le Mans. So
Right.
It was an endurance, race. So we start to kind of, like I said, 2005, you had the Bugatti Veyron, 1,600 horsepower.
Right.
With, the help of EV motors, electric motors on these cars, you start to crack the 2,000 horsepower number for a street legal production car.
It's insane.
So like the Lotus Evija, 2,000 horsepower with the EV, help from the EVs. And then, like right now we've got the Koenigsegg Gamera. Sorry.
Yeah. Gumara.
Gumar. No, Koenigsegg would be like, what, Swedish or something?
Swedish, yes.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be that. That's like Italian. Hey,
Yeah.
Gumar.
Yeah, right.
2,300 horsepower. So,
in the snow?
Well, I didn't even look up how much that weighs.
They're going to give it to you in kilograms too, watch.
Well, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But, HV8 engine plus electric motor, 1,700 kilowatts, 2,300 horsepower, and we're talking about the PS, the metric version, 2,332 PS. So you're essentially your metric and imperial horsepower are very similar.
Yeah.
But yeah, 9-speed clutch.
Yeah.
And it was curb weight, 4,000 pounds.
Sure.
So it's a little bit, it's heavier, but I mean, you look at it and looks very similar to like a sports car,
right.
A Corvette, your C8, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, because some of those...
It just has a shit ton of power.
Right. Well, because you're right, because some of those cars look like prototypes.
Yeah, they look like, the Atom, or like they're basically a go-kart with a gigantic motor.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's actually a car they put together. It's got an interior.
Drivable car,
right,
yeah.
Right.
But same as the Veyron.
Sure. Yeah, that's true.
Bugatti Veyron, that was
for the most part,
somewhat reasonable car to drive.
Yeah.
I mean, comparatively, but
yes. It's not an F1 car, but
no, exactly, and that's the thing is like, is it going to be a little bit slightly comfortable and drivable, or is it a race car?
Right.
And these really started to kind of combine, that where it's streetable somewhat, at least drivable by a somewhat regular person, but got 1,000, 2,000 horsepower.
It's insane.
And that then started to transfer over into the big three muscle cars and performance cars, where we start seeing those insane horsepower numbers for $90,000 muscle car with 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah.
So it's just pretty crazy. We're going to look on Hemmings.com to see kind of what maybe some of these milestone, high horsepower throughout the decades cars will go for. You know, if people are selling them, what condition they're in, and kind of how much they go for. So we're going to start kind of at the beginning of the more modern, not modern muscle car, but the modern horsepower kind of jump, and that's 1949.
Start at the beginning.
Well, yeah, I don't think we're going to find a Carl's-Benz 0.75 horsepower car on here for sale, but the Oldsmobile Rocket 88.
That's right.
1985. We got a couple on here. For the 49s, going for anywhere from about 25,000 for a pretty cool looking car.
Yeah.
One that's a little more hot rodded, it's going for 45,000. And you got to remember, these are your 160 something horsepower.
Right.
Nothing crazy, but it was a kind of a big deal, and what's kind of the early muscle car, early NASCAR.
Yeah.
Even if
and also your early rock and roll song.
And yeah, that was the very first rock and roll song. So you're looking in the range for one of these. You're looking between 25, 40, up to maybe 60,000.
And that makes a lot of sense. Honestly, you're getting a pretty good car for that.
Yeah. And they're in looks like, you know, pretty good condition, you know, like probably wouldn't have any trouble, you know, driving around. And what's even nice too is, you know, Hemmings can kind of verify all that, get some appraisals, you know, going, just to make sure that you're not, you know, getting something that's been sitting for, you know, 50 years.
You want a driver, right?
We jump forward. We talked about the Chrysler 300 being 300 horsepower, the introduction of the Hemi in 1957.
Okay.
You know, we got one on here on Hemmings that's, you know, a lot of people seem to be interested in. There's, you know, 155 people watching this listing, and it's going for right now about $80,000.
Yeah, yeah.
With its low miles, 12,000 miles on it.
Yeah.
You know, great condition. They've restored it. It's, you know, like I said, it's got that 392 Hemi in there. 4-barrel carb.
Right.
You know, this is the peak of starting to get into that huge horsepower, kind of large motor range. And yeah, I mean, everything's just solid on this.
The early Hemi cars are so cool looking too.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, yeah, you're
push button transmissions. You got the huge land yacht, you know, styling. They do drive like land yachts too, but the ones with the Hemis though, you can stand on them and they'll put you in the seat. I mean,
no, I mean, you're looking at that much
engine.
power for, you know, it's not a huge car.
Right,
this is still a 2-door car, not the big 4-door Imperial or anything like that. So, but yeah, so then jumping forward, to the kind of the peak horsepower of the muscle car era.
Right.
So that's your set 1970, you know, Chevy Chevelle. And there's a lot on here for that. But I mean, to me, and I know there's different colors of people, to me, like the blue with the white stripe, that to me was like that Chevelle SS was kind of that
now that was look. And you're talking the LS6 454 engine.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, 5-speed manual, 454, you know, one on here that we've got going, it's showing about $76,000.
Wow.
12,000 miles.
12,000 miles. That must be
very low mileage. Yeah. I guess that's a thing.
Right.
But they've done some restoration on it. They rebuilt the 454.
Okay.
Done some upgrades. You know, we talked Edelbrock. You know, manifold, Holley carb.
Right.
You know, your MSD. You know.
So they made it drivable.
Ignition.
Yeah.
Made it drivable.
Right.
Did, you know, upgraded the rear end, upgraded the you know, transmission.
But I noticed the one that you're looking at right there, that one has a 5-speed in it. So the guy actually took the 4-speed out of it, put a 5-speed in it. So
put a TKO in there.
Put a TKO in it. So it made it a nice driver.
One car we didn't really mention that we probably should have was the Dodge Viper.
True.
Because that was kind of the answer that they had to your supercars, your Ferraris, your you know, fancier cars.
Well, and at the time too, that was kind of the engine that meant horsepower.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So, you know, we're looking at this one. It's a 1997. Obviously, they went for several years. Asking price right now is about $80,000.
Okay. 12,000 miles?
14.
Oh!
This guy went a little extra.
High mileage.
High mileage. I don't know. But, I mean, yeah, you're talking 8-liter V10.
Yes.
You know, everyone else V8 or less. So, coming out with a V10, you know, with a 6-speed, you know, you're talking a lot more power and a lot more you know, performance for the time, for the 90s, basically your mid 90s. And this is, it was V10 rated at 450 horsepower.
Yeah. And I do think
same as your Chevelle.
Right.
The 454 Chevelle.
Yeah. But I do think that was the keeper of horsepower for that time because the 90s were a dark,
the 90s.
Those are dark years for horsepower. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, we bring that up into kind of the modern horsepower era. And, you know, on Hemmings, you know, you can find cars on here for 12 grand, 20 grand to 4 million.
Right.
You know, it's open to anybody, you know, that's making that listing. But a couple of the cool cars on here that are a little bit more modern, you know, kind of performance was, for example, a 2021 McLaren 765 LT.
Sure.
So right now their asking price is about $500,000. So about almost 500,000.
Right.
But super cool car.
Yeah.
And guess how many miles on it?
Don't tell me 12,000.
No, but 1,200.
Oh, okay.
Well, 1,300. So way less.
Okay, way less. Yeah.
But yeah, so you're talking with this. It's a 4-liter twin turbo V8 engine,
right?
755 horsepower.
Yeah.
So that, and it's, way smaller, lighter package than a lot of those. So that's the thing, you're looking at your kind of modern high performance car being in your 700 plus range, or your 1,000 plus, horsepower range. And that's, if that's coming in a small package that's lightweight, you're in a race car basically. So that's what's kind of cool, at least, with this stuff on Hemmings, you can find anything that's going to suit you, for, if you're looking for that classic muscle car, looking for that old school cruiser, or a modern performance, car or luxury car,
or hey, if
you can check it out on there.
Even if you want to value your own car, it's a good place it's a good reference to look at, like, hey, what's my car worth?
And that's and what's really cool too is that they'll do a valuation on your collector car, so you can submit your paperwork, submit all your details, maybe if you've done customized work to it, if you've added more horsepower to it,
right,
they can take that into account on doing the evaluation before you list it, or even just peace of mind or curiosity.
Right.
You can, do that independently.
Well, I'm sure too, that probably helps out with your insurance premiums and, that's being properly covered for your muscle car as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing, it's kind of funny. You talk about the horsepower wars and the muscle car wars. Well, the insurance company knows all about that. So, one of the reasons I remember Chevy, kind of went away with their SS badging for a while is because the insurance companies were going, oh, this is an SS. Oh, you're going to be getting crazier with this. It's got more power. So that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind, maybe if you're looking at some of these performance cars, and just keep in mind your insurance is going to go up. We start getting into the American muscle cars. They kind of started to come back, in the early 2000s, even later on with the Chevy Camaro in 2010, Dodge, brought back the Charger, brought back the Challenger. So that kind of ushered in the modern muscle era.
Definitely for the big three. Yeah.
For the big three.
Right.
And that, your average semi, like your mid-range, model on like your Mustang or your Camaro, was basically more horsepower than your top. Your 1970, the 1970 Chevelle SS 454, like you said, had 450 horsepower.
Yeah.
Your 2024 Camaro has 450 horsepower on the 6.2,
right?
LT5,
every day.
Yeah, without a supercharger, without any of that. Same thing like the Mustang, S5, GT S650,
right?
480 horsepower.
Yeah.
Dodge or Chrysler,
right?
We talked about they had the Hemi.
Yep.
That really, 1957.
Yeah.
That really ramped up the horsepower number,
right?
To 390. They really capitalized on that and took that kind of to the next level and kind of made everybody else jump up too. So we kind of had I don't know if it's our second or if it's our fourth horsepower war, but basically last, 15, 20 years have been the modern horsepower war.
Yeah. So what are some of the numbers on that?
So that's, I mean, and honestly, the Challenger is really kind of where they started making that. And you can get the same engine in, the Chargers or in other vehicles, but, that's your two-door muscle car, was that Challenger.
Right.
So, there's obviously different things of like the Demon, the Hellcat, the Scat Pack, all that kind of stuff. So the Dodge Challenger Hellcat Red Eye, 797 horsepower.
Ooh-wee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we get into the Demon 170.
Yeah.
With your drag key.
Yeah.
That's over 1,000 horsepower.
Right.
It's 1,025 horsepower.
Yeah.
So, and granted, they had it where basically it was detuned to your 700, high 700 range of horsepower.
Right.
And then you do your certain things and your extra key and your all that
electronics.
Yeah. You're basically unlocking the software to bring it over 1,000 horsepower.
That's crazy.
From the dealership. drive it on the street.
Right.
I do know there was stories of some cops knowing like what they were and what they could do, and someone was speeding or whatever. Like a cop, I remember hearing a story where a cop was able to pick out you have that key's not allowed on the street.
Right.
That's only for track. Like basically some guy had started driving the 1,000 horsepower setup on the street, got caught, cops saw it, impounded the car because they're like, yeah, you're currently not street legal,
right,
with that key.
Yeah. I mean, think about it.
That's what is crazy to think about. Of a software tune,
right,
is getting you an extra 200, 300 horsepower.
Yeah,
like that.
Right.
So that's where we're at right now with the technology. You even look at the Corvette Z06, which is granted a smaller engine, but you're 670 horsepower.
Exactly.
Lingenfelter did recently with the E-Ray. So once again, with the electric technology being available, they brought that up into the high 700 range.
Sure.
For that edition of the Lingenfelter. You look at the performance, import cars of your BMWs, you're averaging 600 horsepower on your higher end BMWs.
Right.
Same with the GTR, the Nissan GTR. We talked about that as being like a muscle car.
Right.
And you're in your 600 range on that.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is the ratings, that we look at now, where we're getting into electric vehicles.
Right.
That do have a horsepower rating, but they're more accurately kind of measured by the kilowatt hour, and it varies on your battery, your motors, all that kind of stuff. But the amount of power and torque on an EV motor is above and beyond any production muscle car or performance car.
I totally agree. I think that for the old school guys that are still saying that ICE engines are the way to go, get yourself into an electric car. If
you're wanting to go fast or feel some power, honestly, an EV is, we're looking, the Teslas are in that range, depending on the model and how many motors you get, but the Teslas are in that range of your mid, 500 plus, or and torque is even more. That.
Right.
But the Tesla Plaid, which of course the name comes from, Spaceballs.
Yes.
But that's making, over 1,000 horsepower equivalent.
Yeah.
And it's a full size 4-door car.
Well, they weigh
like
a lot,
6,000 to 7,000 pounds. Cause you're talking all the batteries, all that stuff. So, but that's what a lot of the hypercars and high-end performance and some of the race cars are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're using a combination of the technology, having those EV motors on, one at each wheel, and then, internal combustion to power it, and just basically taking advantage of every technology possible.
EVs are here to stay. Obviously, we've seen like what the guys at Unplugged Performance have done with the Pikes Peak record.
Yeah.
Which, again, too, I'm not taking anything away from ICE engines. Believe me, I'm a huge believer in them. I love them to death.
Yeah.
I would prefer them over an EV. However, if you're going after a number, or if you're going after a record, if you're
going after power, speed,
if you ignore EV technology, you're going to fall short.
And that's it. Yeah, it's honestly, it's more efficient and potentially more powerful, and it's just the technology that we've gotten to. You know, so basically, to kind of wrap this up, because we're going to be diving more into the modern muscle car era, not only of what we mentioned of kind of the resurgence of the OEMs, but some of the builders, that are taking your 60s and 70s and your 80s muscle cars and putting the 1,400 horsepower twin turbo engines in them, building them into modern muscle and modern race cars. But it's pretty crazy to think that 130 years ago.
Yeah.
0.75 horsepower.
Yeah.
And now we're on a street car over 2,000 horsepower.
That's right.
So that's the horsepower evolution. And I don't think 30 years ago, anyone thought we would ever see more than 700 horsepower on a street car.
It was a pretty far-fetched thing.
Unless you were at least production, at least, you know, you're an engine builder, you're you know, street racer, drag racer, sure, you can make that number, but for a production car, no, wasn't even probably thought of.
Wasn't thought of. Yeah. So we're living in fast times.
Yep, and we'll see where it keeps going. I mean, kind of like I said, didn't think we'd see 700, didn't think we'd see 1,000, didn't think we'd see 2,000. Who knows? You know, I guess we'll get into rockets and flying cars, and you know, it'll be a different deal. But
next time
we're going to be still sticking with muscle cars, but who knows? We'll start looking at, you know, flying cars in a couple years.